Chapter 1. The Shadowed Invitation. The late afternoon sun cast long golden fingers across the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's sitting room in St. Mary Mead. She sat in her favourite armchair, a delicate teacup balanced on its saucer, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The peace of the moment was interrupted by the sharp rap of the postman at the door. Miss Marple's maid, Florence, bustled in moments later, holding a cream-coloured envelope sealed with a wax crest. "For you, ma'am," Florence said, her curiosity barely concealed. "Looks important, don't it?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the envelope. The crest bore a stylized raven clutching a rose, unfamiliar yet striking. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, addressed to her in a manner that suggested familiarity. She slit it open with a letter knife, her movements precise. The letter was from a Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a distant cousin by marriage, whom Miss Marple had not seen in decades. Clara wrote of her residence at Ravenwood Hall, a grand old house in the village of Eldridge Hollow, where she lived with 4 other widows, each bound by shared loss and circumstance. The tone was warm, yet edged with urgency. "Dear Jane, I trust this finds you well. I hesitate to trouble you, but strange happenings at Ravenwood compel me to seek your insight. We are 5 widows here, and whispers of mistrust grow louder each day. A valuable heirloom, the raven's tear, a sapphire of some renown, has vanished, and with it, our peace. I fear worse may follow. Could you visit us? Your clarity of mind would be a godsend. Yours in hope, Clara." Miss Marple set the letter down, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Eldridge Hollow," she murmured, "not so far, yet far enough to be its own little world." She recalled snippets of village gossip about Ravenwood Hall, a place said to be as beautiful as it was melancholic, home to women who carried their grief like cloaks. "Florence," she called, her voice gentle but firm, "fetch my timetable, please. I believe I shall be taking a train tomorrow. But, ma'am, you've only just settled from that business at the vicarage." Florence protested, her hands on her hips. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, when trouble calls, it is rarely convenient. And I suspect this trouble at Ravenwood Hall is more than a missing jewel." She returned to her knitting, but her mind was already weaving a different pattern, one of secrets and shadows. Clara's letter hinted at discord among the widows, and Miss Marple knew well how grief could twist into something darker. She thought of her own village, where smiles often hid sharper truths, and wondered what she would find in Eldridge Hollow. The next morning, she packed a modest valise, tucking in her knitting and a small notebook. As the train chugged northward, the green hills of England rolling past, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the 5 widows. Who were they, and what bound them beyond their shared title? The raven's tear sounded like a prize worth coveting, but theft was rarely so simple. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the train lull her, already anticipating the first threads of the mystery she would unravel. Before we move on, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. Arrival in Eldridge Hollow. The train to Eldridge Hollow rattled to a stop just as the sky turned the colour of bruised plums, heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple gathered her valise and shawl, stepping onto the platform with the measured grace of someone accustomed to observing, rather than being observed. The station was little more than a wooden shelter, its paint peeling like old skin, and the air carried the damp, earthy scent of autumn. A single lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the cobbled path leading to the village. A young man in a tweed cap, barely out of his teens, approached her. "Miss Marple?" "I'm Tom, sent from Ravenwood Hall to fetch you." His voice was polite but strained, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "Thank you, Tom," Miss Marple said, offering a kind smile that seemed to ease his nerves. "Is it far to the hall?" "Not far, ma'am, but it's a bit of a climb. The house sits up on the ridge overlooking the hollow." He took her valise, his hands calloused from work, and led her to a horse-drawn cart waiting nearby. The horse, a sturdy chestnut, snorted as Tom climbed aboard, and Miss Marple settled beside him, her eyes already scanning the darkening landscape. Eldridge Hollow unfolded before her as the cart trundled along a winding lane. The village was a cluster of stone cottages huddled around a church spire, their windows glowing like watchful eyes. Beyond, the land rose sharply into a wooded ridge, and there, silhouetted against the stormy sky, stood Ravenwood Hall. It was a sprawling Georgian manor, its once grand facade weathered by time, with ivy clawing at its walls like desperate fingers. 2 towering chimneys flanked a central gable, and the windows, tall and narrow, seemed to stare down with a cold, unwelcoming gaze. "Looks a grim sort of place, don't it?" Tom ventured, his voice low as if the house might overhear. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Houses, like people, often wear their stories on their faces, Tom. I imagine Ravenwood has many to tell." The cart creaked up the final stretch of the drive, gravel crunching under the wheels. As they approached, the front door opened and a figure emerged. A woman in her late 50s, her silver hair pinned neatly under a lace cap, her black dress severe yet elegant. This, Miss Marple deduced, must be Clara Henshaw. Her cousin's face was lined with worry, but her posture was resolute, as if braced against an unseen storm. "Jane, oh, thank heaven you've come!" Clara's voice was warm, but trembled slightly as she clasped Miss Marple's hands. "I feared the weather might delay you." "Not at all, Clara," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing. "A little rain never kept me from a visit. Now tell me, how are things here?" Clara's eyes darted toward the house, then back to Miss Marple. "Worse than I wrote, I'm afraid. Come inside, please. The others are waiting." The entrance hall of Ravenwood Hall was as grand as it was oppressive. A chandelier hung above, its crystals dulled by dust, and a sweeping staircase led to shadowed upper floors. Portraits lined the walls, stern-faced men and women in outdated fashions, their eyes seeming to follow Miss Marple as Clara led her toward a drawing room. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish, mingled with something sharper, like fear. In the drawing room, a fire crackled in a massive hearth, casting flickering light over 4 women seated in a semicircle. They rose as Miss Marple entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and faint hostility. Clara made introductions with the practiced ease of a hostess, though her voice betrayed a nervous edge. "Jane, these are the ladies of Ravenwood Hall, Mrs. Evelyn Drake." She gestured to a tall, angular woman with sharp cheekbones and a widow's veil pinned to her dark hair. "Mrs. Beatrice Langley." A plump woman with rosy cheeks and a nervous habit of twisting her wedding ring, Mrs. Lillian Voss. A strikingly beautiful woman in her early 40s, her auburn hair gleaming despite the sombre black of her dress, and Mrs. Margaret Thorne, a small bird-like woman with darting eyes and a pinched mouth. "Ladies," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle but her gaze keen, "I'm delighted to meet you all. though I understand the circumstances are less than ideal." Evelyn Drake's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. "Clara's told us you're something of a problem solver, Miss Marple. I hope you're not here to stir up trouble." "Oh, I never stir trouble, Mrs. Drake," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "I merely tidy it up when it's been spilled." Beatrice Langley let out a nervous giggle, quickly stifled by a glance from Margaret Thorne. Lillian Voss said nothing, but her green eyes studied Miss Marple with an intensity that suggested she was measuring her worth. Clara cleared her throat. "Jane, you must be tired. Let's get you settled, and we can discuss everything over dinner." As they left the drawing-room, Miss Marple noted the stiffness in the widow's postures, the way their glances avoided one another. The house itself seemed to hum with secrets, its creaking floors and shadowed corners whispering of things unspoken. Clara led her to a guest room on the second floor, its furnishings elegant, but faded, like a memory of better days. A single window overlooked the garden, where leafless trees swayed in the rising wind. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly as her cousin turned to leave, "the raven's tear. When did it go missing?" Clara hesitated, her hand on the doorframe. 3 days ago. It was kept in a locked case in the library. Only we 5 had access, and yet she trailed off, her eyes haunted. "Jane, I fear it's more than theft. There's a darkness here, growing stronger." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. "Rest assured, Clara, I shall do my best to shed light on it." As Clara left, Miss Marple unpacked her valise, placing her knitting on the bedside table. She opened her notebook, jotting down the names of the widows and a few observations. Evelyn, sharp, possibly resentful. Beatrice, nervous, hiding something. Lillian, too composed, watchful. Margaret, defensive, secretive. Clara, genuinely afraid. She closed the notebook, her thoughts drifting to the village below. Eldridge Hollow, like St. Mary Mead, would have its own web of gossip and truths. Tomorrow she would begin to unravel it. Outside, the wind howled, and a distant rumble of thunder echoed over the ridge. Miss Marple stood at the window, gazing at the darkened garden. Somewhere in this house, she knew, lay the key to the mystery, and perhaps something far more dangerous than a stolen sapphire. Chapter 3. The Widows Assemble. The dining room at Ravenwood Hall was a study in faded opulence, its long mahogany table gleaming under a chandelier that cast more shadows than light. Miss Jane Marple sat at one end, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes taking in every detail. The tarnished silver candelabras, the heavy damask curtains, the faint cracks in the plaster ceiling. The 5 widows were seated around the table, their black dresses blending into the dimness, each face a mask of guarded civility. Clara had insisted on a formal dinner to welcome Miss Marple, but the air was thick with unspoken tension, as if the meal were a prelude to something far less pleasant. Clara, at the head of the table, rang a small bell, and a maid, young, with a pale face and nervous hands, began serving a thin vegetable soup. The clink of spoons against porcelain was the only sound for a moment, until Miss Marple, with her usual knack for breaking silences, spoke. "This is a remarkable house, Mrs. Henshaw," she said, her voice light. "How did you all come to share it?" Clara glanced at the others as if seeking permission before answering. "Ravenwood belonged to my late husband, Arthur. After his passing, I found the house too large for one. I invited Evelyn, whose husband was Arthur's business partner, to join me. Over time, Beatrice, Lillian, and Margaret came to us, each widowed, each needing—" A place to belong. Evelyn Drake's sharp laugh cut through the room. A place to belong? That's a generous way of putting it, Clara. We're here because we've nowhere else to go, and this house is as much a cage as a refuge. Her dark eyes flicked to Miss Marple, challenging. Don't let the grandeur fool you, Miss Marple. Ravenwood is a prison of memories. Oh, Evelyn, must you be so dramatic? Beatrice Langley said, her voice high and tremulous. She dabbed at her lips with a napkin, her fingers trembling. It's a fine house, and we've made it our own, haven't we? Lillian Voss, who had been silent, leaned forward, her auburn hair catching the candlelight. Some of us have made it more our own than others, she said, her tone smooth but laced with meaning. Her gaze lingered on Beatrice, who flushed and looked away. Margaret Thorne, the smallest of the widows, set her spoon down with a clatter. If you've something to say, Lillian, say it plainly. I'm tired of your insinuations. Ladies, please, Clara interjected, her hands raised. We have a guest. Let's not air our grievances so soon. Miss Marple sipped her soup, her expression serene, but her mind cataloguing every word, every glance. Grievances are often the key to understanding a household, she said mildly. And I understand there's been a theft. The Raven's Tear, was it? A sapphire, Clara mentioned. The room stilled. The maid hovering near the sideboard froze mid-step, her eyes wide. Evelyn's lips tightened. Beatrice's napkin twisted into a knot. Lillian's smile became a touch too fixed, and Margaret's fingers drummed on the table. Yes, Clara said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. The Raven's Tear was Arthur's pride, a family heirloom passed down for generations. It was kept in a locked case in the library, but 3 days ago we found the case empty. The lock was intact, no sign of tampering. Which means, Evelyn said, her voice cold, one of us took it, or someone in this house did. Or someone from the village, Beatrice added quickly, her cheeks pink. The servants come and go, don't they? And that gardener, Tom, he's always poking about. Tom's been with us for years, Clara said sharply. I won't have him accused without proof. Proof, Lillian murmured, her eyes glinting. That's the trouble, isn't it? We've no proof, only suspicions. And yet we all know someone here isn't what they seem. Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting needles glinting in her mind's eye as she began to weave the threads of their words. A locked case, undisturbed, suggests someone with a key, or great cleverness. How many keys were there? 5, Clara said, her voice heavy. 1 for each of us. Arthur insisted we each have 1, as a symbol of trust when we came to live here. Trust, Margaret snorted, a fine word for a house full of secrets. The maid returned with the next course. Roast pheasant, its aroma rich, but somehow unappetizing in the tense atmosphere. Miss Marple noted the way the widows avoided looking at one another, their movements stiff, their words carefully chosen. She thought of her own village, where a single misplaced word could unravel a lifetime of secrets, and wondered what lay beneath the surface of Ravenwood Hall. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, cutting into her pheasant with delicate precision, you might tell me a little about yourselves. It's always easier to understand a mystery when one knows the players. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. You want our life stories? I doubt they'd interest you, Miss Marple. Mine is simple enough. Married to a man who lost everything in a bad deal, left me with nothing but debts and this house to haunt. Beatrice fidgeted, her voice soft. I was married to a schoolmaster, George. He was kind but delicate. Consumption took him. I came here because Clara was kind enough to offer. Kindness, Lillian said, her tone almost mocking. "My husband was a diplomat, always travelling. When he died abroad, I found myself unwelcome in his circles. Ravenwood was a convenient retreat." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And I was married to a solicitor who thought he could outwit the law. He couldn't. I came here to escape the whispers in London." Miss Marple nodded, her face a picture of polite interest, but her mind was racing. Each widow's story was a fragment, incomplete, like pieces of a broken mirror, reflecting only half-truths. She thought of Clara's letter, the fear woven into its words, and sensed that the theft of the Raven's tear was merely the surface of a deeper wound. As the meal drew to a close, Clara rose, her hands clasped tightly. "Jane, you'll want to rest after your journey. We'll talk more tomorrow. Ladies, shall we retire to the drawing-room?" The widows murmured agreement, but their movements were reluctant, as if each feared being alone or being watched. Miss Marple followed, her steps slow, her eyes catching the smallest details. The way Evelyn's hand lingered near her pocket, Beatrice's hurried glance at the library door, Lillian's too-perfect poise, Margaret's clenched jaw, and Clara's fleeting look of desperation. As they reached the drawing-room, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and the chandelier flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. Beatrice gasped, and Margaret muttered something under her breath. When the light returned, Miss Marple saw Clara's face, pale and drawn, and knew that the darkness in Ravenwood Hall was not just in its shadows. "Thank you for the lovely dinner," Miss Marple said, her voice as calm as ever. "I think I shall retire now. A good night's rest sharpens the mind, don't you find?" As she climbed the stairs to her room, the house creaked around her, whispering secrets she was determined to uncover. The Raven's tear was gone, but something far more dangerous lingered in its place. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The morning broke over Eldridge Hollow with a reluctant dawn, the sky a patchwork of grey clouds that seemed to press down on Ravenwood Hall. Miss Jane Marple rose early, her sleep undisturbed by the creaks and groans of the old house, though her mind had been restless, turning over the widow's words from the night before. She dressed in a simple tweed skirt and cardigan, her white hair neatly pinned, and tucked her notebook into her handbag before descending to the breakfast room. The room was smaller than the dining hall, its windows overlooking a tangled rose garden. A sideboard held a modest spread of toast, marmalade and tea, served by the same nervous maid from dinner, whose name Miss Marple had learned was Elsie. Clara was already there, pouring tea with a hand that trembled slightly, while Beatrice Langley sat nibbling a piece of toast, her eyes darting to the door. The other widows were absent, their empty chairs adding to the room's uneasy quiet. "Good morning, Clara, Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple said brightly, taking a seat. "I trust you slept well." Clara managed a weak smile. "As well as one can in this house, Jane. The wind was fierce last night." Beatrice nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I heard footsteps in the hall, but it was probably just the storm." "Or ghosts," Elsie muttered as she set a teapot down, then flushed and hurried out. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her expression amused but alert. "Ghosts, Clara? Does Ravenwood have such stories?" Clara sighed, stirring her tea absently. "Every old house has its tales. Arthur used to laugh about them, said the ravens in the crest brought bad luck. But it's the living I worry about, not the dead." Beatrice dropped her toast, her face paling. "Oh, Clara, don't say such things. It's bad enough with the sapphire gone." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes soft but piercing. "Mrs. Langley, you mentioned the gardener last night. Tom, was it? Do you truly suspect him?" Beatrice's hands fluttered to her necklace, a simple locket. I don't know, it's just he's always in the garden, near the library windows, and he's so quiet, always watching." "Watching is not the same as stealing," Miss Marple said gently. "But I'd like to see the library, Clara, if I may. The scene of the crime, so to speak." Clara nodded, rising. "Of course, it's this way." The library was a cavernous room, its walls lined with leather-bound books that smelled of dust and time. A massive oak desk dominated one end, and near it stood a glass-fronted case, its lock gleaming despite the emptiness within. Miss Marple examined the case, noting its sturdy construction and the lack of scratches or pry marks. "5 keys, you said?" she murmured, "and each of you has one." "Yes," Clara replied, producing a small brass key from her pocket. "Mine's here. The others keep theirs. Well, I assume they do." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, lingering on a faded portrait above the fireplace, a stern man with a raven perched on his shoulder, his eyes eerily like Clara's. "Arthur, I presume?" Clara nodded, her expression softening. He loved this room. The raven's tier was his pride, not just for its value, but for what it meant. Continuity, family. Before Miss Marple could respond, the door opened and Evelyn Drake entered, her black dress crisp and her posture rigid. "Snooping already, Miss Marple," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. "I suppose Clara's told you we're all suspects." "I don't think in terms of suspects, Mrs. Drake," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "I think of stories. Everyone has one, and they often overlap in unexpected ways." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she didn't retort. Instead, she crossed to a bookshelf and pulled out a slim volume, flipping it open to reveal a hidden compartment. "This is where I keep my key," she said, almost defiantly, showing a brass key identical to Clara's. "I haven't touched the case in months." "Very sensible," Miss Marple said, though her mind noted the ease with which Evelyn revealed her hiding place. Too easy, perhaps? As they returned to the hall, Lillian Voss descended the staircase, her auburn hair loosely pinned, her dress less severe than the others. "Good morning," she said, her voice like velvet. "I see we're already playing detective. Shall I fetch my key too? Or is that too obvious?" "There's no need, Mrs. Voss," Miss Marple said, smiling. "I'm sure it's safe. Though I wonder, did any of you notice anything odd before the theft? Visitors, perhaps, or unusual behavior?" Lillian's smile tightened. "Odd is a relative term here. We're 5 women with too much time and too many memories. But if you must know, I saw Beatrice in the garden late one night last week near the library windows." Beatrice, who had followed them, gasped. "I was only walking. I couldn't sleep. And the roses. I like the roses." "In the dark," Lillian said, raising an eyebrow. "You're braver than I, Beatrice." Miss Marple observed the exchange, her face serene but her thoughts racing. Beatrice's nervousness was palpable, but Lillian's accusation felt calculated, as if meant to deflect. She made a mental note to visit the garden later. Margaret Thorne appeared then, her small frame almost swallowed by the hall's grandeur. "What's this about the garden?" she snapped. "Are we accusing each other now? I'll have you know my key's locked in my room, and I've not been near the library." "No one's accusing anyone, Mrs. Thorne," Miss Marple said soothingly. "I'm merely trying to understand the house and its rhythms. Tell me, do you all spend much time together?" Margaret snorted. "As little as possible." We dine together, play cards sometimes, but we're not a knitting circle, Miss Marple." "Though you do knit, don't you, Jane?" Clara said, a faint smile breaking through her worry. "Perhaps you'll teach us." Miss Marple chuckled, but her eyes were on Margaret, who seemed to shrink under scrutiny. "Knitting is a great clarifier," she said. "It untangles knots, much like conversation." The morning passed with Miss Marple wandering the house, her steps slow but purposeful. She noted the locked doors, the dusty corners, the way the widows avoided certain rooms. In the afternoon she slipped into the village, visiting the post office and the tea shop, where she listened to gossip with her usual unobtrusive charm. The villagers spoke of Ravenwood with awe and unease, tales of the Sapphire's curse, of Arthur Henshaw's sudden death, of the widow's reclusive ways. One name came up repeatedly: Tom, the gardener, who was said to have a temper and a past no one quite knew. Returning to Ravenwood, Miss Marple found Clara in the drawing-room, staring at a photograph of Arthur. "Jane," Clara said, her voice low, "I didn't tell you everything in my letter. The sapphire, it wasn't just stolen. There was a note left in the case, written in Arthur's hand. It said, 'The truth will break us all.'" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her voice remained gentle. "And you kept this note?" Clara nodded, pulling a crumpled paper from her pocket. The handwriting was masculine, hurried, the ink faded but clear. Miss Marple read it, her mind weaving new threads. A note in a dead man's hand, a stolen gem, 5 widows with keys. What a truth could break them? As the day waned, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting in her lap, her notebook open. She wrote, Evelyn, defensive, quick to show her key. Beatrice, nervous, caught in the garden. Lillian, accusing, too smooth. Margaret, evasive, isolated. Clara, hiding something, perhaps out of fear. The note, Arthur's or a forgery? She closed the notebook, her thoughts turning to the garden and the library windows. Tomorrow she would look closer, for the whispers of the past were growing louder. And she sensed they were leading to something far darker than a stolen sapphire. Chapter 5. The Midnight Cry. The clock in Ravenwood Hall's entrance hall struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the silent corridors like a warning. Miss Jane Marple lay awake in her guest room, her knitting untouched on the bedside table, her ears attuned to the house's nocturnal whispers. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving a brittle stillness, but the air felt charged, as if the walls themselves held their breath. She had spent the evening replaying the day's conversations, the widow's guarded words, and the cryptic note in Arthur's hand. The truth will break us all. It was a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that puzzles often unravelled in the quiet hours when masks slipped. A faint sound broke her. Thoughts, a muffled thud, followed by a stifled cry from somewhere below. She sat up, her heart steady but her senses sharp. Slipping on her dressing gown and soft-soled shoes, she took her small flashlight and eased open her door. The corridor was dark, the moonlight filtering through high windows casting eerie patterns on the floor. She moved silently, her steps practiced from years of navigating St. Mary Mead's gossip-laden lanes unnoticed. The cry had come from the direction of the drawing-room. As she descended the staircase, her flashlight's beam caught the glint of a brass candlestick on a side table, its base slightly askew. She paused, noting it, then continued. The drawing-room door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hall. Inside, she heard a low, anguished sob. Miss Marple pushed the door open gently and found Beatrice Langley crumpled on the floor near the fireplace, her nightgown dishevelled, her hands clutching a torn piece of fabric. A small table lay overturned, its contents, a teacup, a book, a silver letter opener, scattered across the rug. Beatrice's eyes widened at the sight of Miss Marple, her face pale with terror. "Oh, Miss Marple!" she gasped, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to. I only came down for a book, and then someone was here." Miss Marple knelt beside her, her touch gentle but firm. "Calm yourself, Mrs. Langley. Tell me exactly what happened." Beatrice's hands shook as she clutched the fabric, a scrap of black silk embroidered with a tiny raven. "I couldn't sleep, so I came to get my novel. The fire was still lit, but as I reached for the book, I heard a rustle behind me. I turned, and someone pushed me. The table fell, and I heard them run out. This was caught on the hearth." Miss Marple examined the fabric, her fingers tracing the delicate stitching. The raven matched the crest on Clara's letter, a symbol of the house. "Did you see who it was?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. "No, it was too dark." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "But they were quick and I think they wore black. Oh, Miss Marple, what if they meant to hurt me?" Before Miss Marple could respond, footsteps sounded in the hall, and Clara appeared, her face drawn, a shawl thrown over her nightdress. "Jane! Beatrice! What's happened?" Beatrice recounted her story, her voice rising with panic. Clara's expression darkened as she listened, her eyes darting to the overturned table. "This is madness," she whispered. "First the sapphire, now this." Miss Marple stood, her flashlight sweeping the room. The windows were latched, the curtains undisturbed, but a faint draught brushed her cheek, suggesting another door or passage. She noted the letter opener, its blade gleaming faintly, and the book, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights, open to a page marked with a ribbon. "We mustn't jump to conclusions," Miss Marple said calmly. "Mrs. Langley, you're unharmed, and that's what matters. But I think it best we all return to our rooms for now. Clara, could you fetch Elsie to help Mrs. Langley?" Clara nodded, hurrying out, while Miss Marple helped Beatrice to her feet. "Do try to rest, my dear," she said, "and keep your door locked tonight." As Beatrice shuffled upstairs, Miss Marple lingered, her flashlight probing the room's corners. She found a small side door, half hidden behind a tapestry, leading to a narrow servant's passage. It was unlatched, its hinges well oiled, suggesting frequent use. She closed it softly, her mind racing. A figure in black, a torn scrap of silk, a secret passage. This was no random theft, but a carefully woven web. By the time Clara returned with Elsie, Miss Marple was back in the drawing room, her demeanour serene. "All's well now," she said, though her eyes held a glint of determination. "But I think we should gather everyone tomorrow morning. This incident changes things," Clara agreed, her face pale. "Jane, I'm frightened. First the sapphire, then that note, and now this. What's happening to us?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "Fear makes things seem larger than they are, Clara. We'll find the truth, bit by bit." Back in her room, Miss Marple sat at the small desk, her notebook open. She wrote, "Beatrice attacked, or staged, scrap of silk, deliberately left. Passage suggests inside knowledge. Who wears black besides the widows? Elsie? Tom?" The note's warning looms larger. She closed the notebook, her thoughts turning to the other widows. Evelyn's sharpness, Lillian's composure, Margaret's defensiveness. Each could have motive. Each could have moved through that passage. As she slipped into bed, the house creaked around her, and a distant owl hooted in the garden. Miss Marple thought of her village, where late-night disturbances often hid simple truths, a lover's quarrel, a petty theft. But Ravenwood Hall was different, its secrets deeper, its stakes higher. The cry in the night was a warning, and she knew the morning would bring more threads to untangle. Chapter 6. The Inspector's Arrival. The morning after Beatrice's midnight ordeal dawned cold and grey, the light filtering through Ravenwood Hall's windows as if reluctant to illuminate its secrets. Miss Jane Marple was up early, her knitting untouched as she sat by her window, her notebook open to a fresh page. The events of the night, the cry, the overturned table, the scrap of black silk with its raven embroidery, had sharpened her focus. The house was no longer just a setting for a theft. It was a stage for something far more sinister. Breakfast was a strained affair, with the widows gathered in the dining room, their faces drawn. Beatrice sat hunched, her eyes red from lack of sleep, while Evelyn Drake stirred her tea with a clatter. Her expression one of barely concealed irritation. Lillian Voss maintained her poised calm, though her fingers toyed with a pearl brooch, betraying a hint of unease. Margaret Thorne was absent, her chair empty, and Clara explained she was indisposed after the night's disturbance. Miss Marple noted the absence, her mind filing it away. As the meal ended, the front door's knocker echoed through the hall, a heavy, authoritative sound. Clara rose, her face paling. "That'll be Inspector Harrow," she said, her voice tight. "I sent for him this morning. After last night, I thought it best." The widows exchanged glances, some wary, others defiant. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her ears attuned to the undercurrents. She had dealt with policemen before, earnest men, often thorough, but prone to missing the subtleties of human nature. She was curious to see what kind of man Inspector Harrow would be. He entered the dining room moments later, a tall figure in a dark suit, his face weathered but sharp, with grey eyes that missed little. His moustache was neatly trimmed, and his manner was brisk but polite. Behind him trailed a young constable, notebook in hand, looking faintly overwhelmed by the grandeur of Ravenwood Hall. "Good morning, ladies," Inspector Harrow said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Henshaw, thank you for your message. I understand there's been a theft, and now an assault?" Clara nodded, gesturing to Beatrice. "Mrs. Langley was attacked last night in the drawing-room. She's unharmed, but it's shaken us all. And yes, the raven's tear, our sapphire, was stolen 3 days ago." Harrow's eyes flicked to Beatrice, then to Miss Marple, lingering a moment as if assessing her presence. "And you are?" "Miss Jane Marple," she said, her smile gentle. "A guest of my cousin Clara. I'm merely visiting, but I take an interest in such matters." Harrow's moustache twitched, a hint of amusement or scepticism. "I see. Well, Miss Marple, I'll handle things from here. Mrs. Langley, tell me what happened." Beatrice recounted her story, her voice trembling but clearer than the night before. She described the rustle, the push, the overturned table, and the scrap of silk. Harrow listened intently, his constable scribbling notes. When Beatrice finished, he examined the silk fragment, his brow furrowing at the raven embroidery. "This is from the house?" he asked Clara. "Yes," she replied, her hands clasped tightly. "It's part of an old shawl, one of Arthur's family relics. We all have pieces of it, curtains, cushions, even a dress or two." "Which means," Evelyn interjected, her tone sharp, "it could belong to any of us, or none of us. The servants handle those fabrics too." Harrow nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll need to see the library where the sapphire was kept, and I'll want statements from everyone, including the staff." Miss Marple watched as Harrow moved through the library, his fingers tracing the lock on the empty case, his questions precise but predictable. He asked about the keys, the widow's routines, and any visitors to the house. Clara answered fully, Evelyn with clipped reluctance, Lillian with smooth evasiveness, and Beatrice with nervous stammers. Margaret, summoned at last, was curt, claiming she'd been asleep during the attack and knew nothing of the theft. As Harrow questioned Elsie, the maid, Miss Marple slipped into the background, her eyes catching details the inspector missed. The way Elsie's hands shook when asked about Tom, the gardener, the faint smudge of ink on Lillian's cuff, the way Evelyn's gaze lingered on the portrait of Arthur. She also noted the constable's clumsy handling of the silk scrap, tucking it into his pocket without care, and made a mental note to examine it later. After the interviews, Harrow gathered the widows in the drawing room, his tone grave. "This is no simple theft," he said. "The sapphire's value is clear, but last night's attack suggests something deeper. I'll be stationing Constable Reed here for the day, and I'll need access to your rooms to check for the gem or other evidence." Evelyn's eyes flashed. "You mean to search our private quarters? That's outrageous." "It's procedure, Mrs. Drake," Harrow said firmly. "If you've nothing to hide, there's no cause for concern." Lillian smiled faintly. "Procedure or not, Inspector, you'll find nothing. We're widows, not criminals." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "Inspector, might I suggest checking the servants' passage behind the drawing room? It was unlatched last night, and it may offer clues." Harrow's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll look into it." As the inspector and constable moved off, Clara approached Miss Marple, her face anxious. "Jane, do you think Beatrice was truly attacked? Or could she have staged it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "My dear Clara, people are rarely what they seem, even to themselves, but that scrap of silk, it's a thread in a larger tapestry. We must see where it leads." The rest of the day passed with Harrow's investigation stirring the house like a storm. The widows retreated to their rooms, their doors locked, while Constable Reed patrolled the halls, his boots loud on the creaking floors. Miss Marple took the opportunity to visit the village again, chatting with the postmistress and the publican, who spoke of Tom's solitary nature, and a rumour that one of the widows, unnamed, had been seen arguing with a stranger in the woods weeks ago. Returning to Ravenwood, Miss Marple found Elsie in the kitchen, polishing silver with furious energy. "Elsie," she said gently, "you seemed troubled when the inspector mentioned Tom. Is there something you'd like to share?" Elsie's hands froze, her eyes wide. "No, ma'am, it's just Tom's a good lad, but he's private. People talk, say he's trouble, but he's loyal to Mrs. Henshaw." Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. "Loyalty is a fine thing, Elsie. But sometimes it hides other truths. If you think of anything, you'll tell me, won't you?" Elsie nodded, her lips tight, and Miss Marple left her to her work, her mind turning over the new pieces. The passage, the silk, the stranger in the woods. As evening fell, she sat in her room, her notebook open, jotting Harrow, competent but linear. Silk, deliberate clue or careless mistake. Tom suspected, but why? Stranger, connected to theft or attack. She closed the notebook, her thoughts drifting to the note in Arthur's hand. The truth, it seemed, was closer and more dangerous than anyone realized. Chapter 7. Hidden Letters and Lies. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the heavy clouds over Ravenwood Hall, casting a pallor over the house that matched the growing unease within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, her knitting in her lap, though her needles lay still. She had spent the morning observing Inspector Harrow's methodical searches, noting how the widows reacted. Evelyn's sharp protests, Beatrice's nervous hovering, Lillian's cool detachment, Margaret's sullen absence, and Clara's quiet resignation. The inspector had found nothing in their rooms, no sapphire, no telltale clues, but Miss Marple knew that secrets were rarely so easily uncovered. She had asked Clara's permission to examine the library more closely, and now she stood before the empty case where the raven's tear had once rested. The lock was pristine, its brass gleaming, but her eyes were drawn to the desk nearby, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a small brass paperweight shaped like a raven. She ran her fingers lightly over the desk's edge, feeling for irregularities, her mind recalling a similar desk in St. Mary Mead, where a vicar's wife had hidden love letters in a false drawer. "Clara," Miss Marple called softly, knowing her cousin was nearby, sorting books to calm her nerves. "Did Arthur ever mention a hidden compartment in this desk? Old houses like this often have such tricks." Clara looked up, her brow furrowing. "Not that I recall, Jane, but Arthur was full of surprises. He loved this desk, spent hours here, writing letters, managing accounts." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers probing gently until she felt a slight give. With a soft click, a narrow panel sprang open, revealing a shallow compartment. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, their edges yellowed with age. Clara gasped, crossing the room to peer over Miss Marple's shoulder. "Those are Arthur's," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I'd found all his papers after he died." Miss Marple untied the ribbon carefully, her movements deliberate. The letters were addressed to different women, the handwriting unmistakably Arthur's, matching the note Clara had shown her. "The truth will break us all." She skimmed the first few, her eyes catching phrases that spoke of affection, promises, and regret. One letter, addressed to an ED, hinted at a shared secret, a debt unpaid. Another, to a LV, spoke of a meeting in the garden, forbidden but cherished. "Clara," Miss Marple said gently, "did Arthur know all the widows before they came to Ravenwood?" Clara's face paled, her hands twisting together. "Evelyn's husband was his business partner, so yes, he knew her. The others, I thought they came to us by chance, through mutual acquaintances. But these letters—" Before she could finish, the library door swung open, and Lillian Voss entered, her auburn hair catching the light like a flame. Her eyes flicked to the letters in Miss Marple's hand, and for a moment her composure faltered. "What have you found now, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged. "Old correspondence," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "They seem to belong to Arthur. Do you recognize them, Mrs. Voss?" Lillian's smile was tight. "Arthur was a prolific writer. He sent letters to half the county, I imagine. Those could be anyone's." Miss Marple held her gaze, noting the slight tremor in Lillian's fingers. "Perhaps, but they're quite personal. I wonder if they might shed light on the sapphire's theft, or last night's incident." Lillian's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, turning instead to a bookshelf, as if dismissing the matter. Clara, however, looked stricken, clutching the edge of the desk. "Jane, do you think these have something to do with the raven's tear?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, tying the letters back together. "Secrets have a way of leaving traces, don't they?" As Lillian left, her steps quick and purposeful, Miss Marple slipped the letters into her handbag, intending to read them more thoroughly later. She and Clara returned to the drawing room, where Inspector Harrow was questioning Tom, the gardener, his face red with indignation. "I ain't touched no sapphire," Tom said, his voice rough. "I work the gardens, not the house. Ask Elsie. She'll tell you I'm out there dawn to dusk." Harrow's grey eyes were steady. "And last night, Tom? Where were you when Mrs. Langley was attacked?" "In my cottage asleep," Tom snapped. "I don't prowl the house at night, unlike some." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the implication, but before she could ask, Evelyn stormed in, her face flushed. "This is absurd, Inspector. You're badgering the staff when the thief is likely among us. Why don't you ask Lillian where she was last night? Or Margaret, who's been hiding in her room all day?" Harrow raised a hand. "Mrs. Drake, I'll question everyone in turn. For now, Tom, you're free to go, but don't leave the estate." Tom muttered something under his breath and left, brushing past Beatrice, who had just entered, her face pale and her locket clutched tightly. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice quavering. "Did you find something in the library?" "Just old letters," Clara said quickly, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple, pleading for discretion. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly, though her mind was racing. The letters suggested Arthur had connections to at least two of the widows, Evelyn and Lillian, beyond what Clara knew. Were they romantic, financial, and what of the others? She thought of Beatrice's nervousness, Margaret's absence, and the scrap of silk from the night before. The house was a maze of lies, and the letters were a map she needed to decipher. That evening, as the widows dined in tense silence, Miss Marple excused herself early, retreating to her room. She spread the letters on her desk, reading each carefully. One, addressed to B.L., spoke of forgiveness and a shared loss, hinting at a child who never was. Another, to M.T., mentioned a legal matter, a debt Arthur promised to settle. The final letter, unsigned, was a draft, its tone desperate. "I cannot keep this secret any longer. The tear must be returned, or all will be lost." Miss Marple's pen paused over her notebook as she wrote. Letters. Arthur's ties to each widow, possibly all 5. Secrets, debts, love, loss. The note in the case, his or a forgery to mislead. Tom defensive but honest. Lillian too quick to deflect. She closed the notebook, her thoughts turning to the garden, where Lillian had met someone, according to the letters. Tomorrow she would explore it, for the truth was beginning to take shape, like a pattern emerging from her knitting. As she prepared for bed, a faint creak sounded outside her door, a footstep, cautious and deliberate. She paused, her flashlight in hand, but the sound did not return. Ravenwood Hall was alive with secrets, and Miss Marple knew that one false step could unravel everything, or destroy it. Chapter 8. The Garden Confession. The morning mist clung to the gardens of Ravenwood Hall, veiling the tangled roses and overgrown hedges in a ghostly shroud. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her woolen shawl, stepped out after breakfast, her eyes sharp despite the early hour. The letters found in the library desk had stirred her thoughts all night. Their words, promises, regrets and veiled threats, pointing to a web of connections between Arthur Henshaw and the widows. The garden, mentioned in one of Lillian's letters, seemed a likely place to uncover more, especially after Beatrice's claim of being attacked near the library windows. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Miss Marple followed a gravel path that wound past a crumbling fountain, its stone cherub stained with moss. The library windows loomed above, their frames weathered but intact, offering a clear view into the garden. She noted the low hedge beneath, its branches trampled in places, as if someone had stood there recently, watching or listening. As she rounded a corner, she found Tom, the gardener, pruning a rose bush with sharp, deliberate cuts. His cap was pulled low, his expression guarded, but he nodded politely as she approached. "Morning, Miss Marple. Not many come out here this early." "I find gardens very telling, Tom," she said, her voice gentle. "They show care, or neglect, in ways people try to hide. You've a heavy task keeping this one in order." Tom grunted, his shears pausing. "It's a losing battle, ma'am. The roses are wild, like the house. Mrs. Henshaw tries, but the others, they don't care much for it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Do any of the ladies walk here often? Mrs. Voss, perhaps? Or Mrs. Langley?" Tom's hands stilled, his jaw tightening. "Mrs. Voss comes out sometimes, late at night. Says she likes the quiet. Mrs. Langley's been out too, fidgeting like she's looking for something. Can't say more than that." She nodded, filing away his words. "And you, Tom?" "You're out here often, near the library. Did you ever see anything unusual, say, around the time the sapphire went missing?" His eyes flicked to hers, then away. "I see plenty, ma'am, but I keep to my work. People in this house, they're not always what they seem." Before Miss Marple could press further, a rustle came from the path behind. Lillian Voss emerged, her auburn hair loose under a wide-brimmed hat, her black dress replaced with a deep green one that seemed out of place in the house's morning atmosphere. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "exploring our wilderness? Or hunting for clues?" "A bit of both, Mrs. Voss," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "The garden's a lovely spot. I understand you enjoy it at night." Lillian's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on her gloves. "Who told you that?" "Tom, I suppose. He's always watching, isn't he?" Tom muttered something and returned to his pruning, his back stiff. Miss Marple gestured to a stone bench nearby, its surface damp but inviting. "Shall we sit, Mrs. Voss? I'd like to hear more about your time here at Ravenwood." Lillian hesitated, then sat, her posture elegant but tense. "There's little to tell. I came here after my husband's death, seeking peace. I found complications instead." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "Complications often come from the past, don't they? I found some letters in the library, Arthur's letters. One mentioned a meeting in this garden, with you." Lillian's face froze, her green eyes narrowing. "You've been busy, haven't you? Those letters are old, meaningless. Arthur was a friend, nothing more. He wrote to many people." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "but the letter spoke of something forbidden, something you both guarded. Was it about the raven's tear?" Lillian stood abruptly, her gloves twisting in her hands. "You're fishing, Miss Marple, and I don't appreciate it. Yes, I met Arthur here once or twice. We talked about life, loss, nothing sinister. If you think I stole the sapphire, say it plainly." Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded. "I'm not accusing, Mrs. Voss. I'm listening. But secrets, like weeds, grow best in the dark. What did you and Arthur talk about in this garden?" For a moment, Lillian seemed to waver, her composure cracking. Then, her voice low, she said, "He loved me once, before Clara. It was years ago, before I married my husband. When I came to Ravenwood, it stirred old feelings. We met here to talk, to bury the past, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind racing. "And did anyone else know of these meetings? Mrs. Henshaw, perhaps?" Lillian's laugh was bitter. "Clara? She's too wrapped in her grief to notice. But Evelyn, she's got eyes like a hawk. And Beatrice, she's always skulking about, nervous as a mouse." As Lillian spoke, a shadow moved near the library windows, a fleeting figure too quick to identify. Miss Marple's eyes flicked upward, but Lillian didn't notice, her gaze fixed on the roses. "Mrs. Voss," Miss Marple said softly, "did Arthur ever mention a debt or a promise tied to the sapphire?" Lillian's head snapped up, her face pale. "A debt, number. But he said the tear was cursed, that it brought ruin to those who kept it. I thought he was joking." Miss Marple stood, brushing off her shawl. "Thank you, Mrs. Voss. You've been most helpful." Lillian hesitated, then turned and walked away. Her steps hurried. Miss Marple watched her go, then approached the trampled hedge beneath the library windows. She found a small button, black and plain, caught in the branches. It could belong to anyone in the house, or no one. She tucked it into her pocket, her thoughts turning to Lillian's confession. An old love, buried but not forgotten, could be a powerful motive or a clever lie. Returning to the house, she found Clara in the hall, her face anxious. "Jane, Inspector Harrow's back. He wants to speak to us all. He found something in the servants' passage." Miss Marple followed Clara to the drawing room, where the widows were gathered, their expressions a mix of dread and defiance. Harrow held up a small vial, its contents a clear liquid. "This was hidden behind a loose panel in the passage," he said, his voice grim. "It's arsenic, enough to kill." Beatrice gasped. Evelyn's eyes widened, and Lillian's hand went to her brooch. Margaret, who had joined them at last, muttered, "This is madness." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, though her heart quickened. "Inspector," she said, "where exactly was it found?" "Near the drawing room entrance," Harrow replied. "Someone meant to hide it, or retrieve it later." The widows exchanged glances, suspicion crackling like static. Miss Marple's mind raced. The letters, Lillian's confession, the button, the arsenic. The threads were tightening, but the pattern was still unclear. She wrote in her notebook, "Lillian admits to affair with Arthur." Arsenic, whose? Button, another clue or misdirection. Evelyn or Beatrice watching from the window. The garden had yielded a confession, but the house held more lies. And Miss Marple knew the next revelation might be deadly. Chapter 9. Shadows in the Attic. The discovery of the arsenic vial sent a chill through Ravenwood Hall, its implications hanging over the widows like a storm cloud. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room that afternoon, her notebook open, her pen pausing as she considered the mounting clues. Arthur's letters, Lillian's confession of an old affair, the black button from the garden, and now poison hidden in a secret passage. The house was a labyrinth of deceit, and she sensed the truth lay not just in what was said, but in what was concealed in its forgotten corners. After lunch, with Inspector Harrow occupied questioning the staff, Miss Marple decided to explore the upper floors of Ravenwood. Clara had mentioned an attic, rarely used, where old furniture and family relics were stored. "It's a dusty mess," Clara had said, but Arthur kept odd things up there. Papers, trinkets, things he couldn't part with. Miss Marple, who knew how often the past whispered through neglected spaces, resolved to investigate. She climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, her flashlight casting a thin beam through the gloom. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous space cluttered with trunks, draped mirrors, and broken chairs. Cobwebs hung like lace, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning for anything that might connect to the sapphire, the letters or the arsenic. Near a small, grimy window, She found a trunk marked with the raven crest, its lock rusted but intact. Using a hairpin, she worked the lock with the practiced ease of someone who had once helped a neighbour retrieve a lost key from a similar trunk in St. Mary Mead. Inside, she found a collection of faded documents, ledgers, receipts, and a small leather-bound journal. The journal's pages were brittle, but Arthur's handwriting was unmistakable. She skimmed entries from years past, noting references to business deals gone sour, debts owed to Evelyn's husband, and a cryptic mention of LV's request for funds to settle a delicate matter. As she read, a floorboard creaked behind her. Miss Marple turned, her flashlight catching Margaret Thorne's small, tense figure in the doorway, her eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing up here, Miss Marple?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp but unsteady. "Merely exploring, Mrs. Thorne," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "Old houses hold such stories, don't they? I found Arthur's journal. It mentions a debt tied to you, a legal matter perhaps." Margaret's face tightened, her hands clenching. "You've no right to pry into that. Arthur helped my husband with a case, that's all. It was settled years ago." Miss Marple closed the journal, her eyes kind but probing. "And yet you've been so withdrawn, Mrs. Thorne, almost as if you fear something coming to light." Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You don't understand this house, Miss Marple. Everyone here has something to hide. Evelyn's debts, Lillian's past, Beatrice's nerves, they're all tangled up with Arthur. And that sapphire, it wasn't just a jewel, it was his way of controlling us." "Controlling?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind racing. "How so?" Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "I've said too much. Leave the attic, Miss Marple. You're stirring up things best left buried." She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the stairs. Miss Marple tucked the journal into her handbag, her thoughts swirling. Margaret's words suggested the raven's tear was more than a family heirloom, perhaps a symbol of power or blackmail. She continued her search, finding a small velvet box hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten curtains. Inside was a single earring, its sapphire glinting like a tiny echo of the missing tear. A note tucked beneath it read, "For E.D., a promise kept." Before she could ponder further, a crash sounded from below, followed by raised voices. Miss Marple hurried downstairs, the journal and earrings safe in her bag. In the drawing room, she found Inspector Harrow holding a heated discussion with Evelyn Drake, who stood with her arms crossed, her face flushed with anger. "You can't accuse me without proof," Evelyn snapped. "That vial means nothing. Anyone could have hidden it." Harrow's voice was calm but firm. "Mrs. Drake, we found your fingerprints on the panel where the arsenic was hidden. Care to explain?" Evelyn's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly. "I dust the passages sometimes. The servants are lazy, that's all." Miss Marple, lingering in the doorway, noted Evelyn's quick deflection, and the way Beatrice, seated nearby, clutched her locket, her face pale. Lillian, standing by the window, watched with a faint, unreadable smile, while Clara wrung her hands, looking from Evelyn to Harrow. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, stepping forward, "might I see the vial again? And perhaps the silk scrap from last night?" Harrow hesitated, then nodded, producing both from an evidence bag. The vial was small, its label faded but legible. Arsenic, pharmaceutical grade. The silk, with its raven embroidery, was frayed but distinct. Miss Marple examined them, her mind connecting threads. The earring for E.D., the arsenic near the passage, Margaret's fear of exposure. Mrs. Drake, she said softly, you mentioned debts yesterday. Were they tied to Arthur? Perhaps through your husband's business? Evelyn's jaw tightened. What are you implying, Miss Marple? My husband's failures are no secret. Arthur bailed us out once, but that's old history. Old history often casts long shadows, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. And shadows, I find, hide the most interesting truths. Harrow cleared his throat, clearly impatient. Miss Marple, I appreciate your interest, but I'll handle this. Mrs. Drake, you'll need to come to the station for further questioning. As Evelyn protested, Miss Marple retreated to her room, her notebook open. She wrote, earring, Evelyn's, a gift or a bribe, journal, debts and secrets linking all widows. Margaret knows more than she says. Arsenic, Evelyn's prince, but too convenient. She closed the notebook, her thoughts turning to the attic's shadows and the journal's cryptic entries. The raven's tear was the key, but its theft was only part of a larger tapestry, one woven with betrayal, fear, and perhaps murder. As night fell, the house seemed to close in, its creaks louder, its shadows deeper. Miss Marple knew the next discovery might unravel everything, or tighten the noose around an innocent neck. Chapter 10. Accusations and Alibis. The tension in Ravenwood Hall had thickened like fog, each widow's glance laden with suspicion, each creak of the house amplifying the unspoken fears. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room the following morning, her knitting a quiet rhythm in her hands, though her eyes missed nothing. Inspector Harrow's discovery of Evelyn's fingerprints on the panel hiding the arsenic vial had set the household abuzz, and the widows were summoned for a meeting after breakfast. Evelyn's protests echoed through the halls, but Miss Marple sensed the truth was still buried, waiting to be unearthed like a root in the overgrown garden. The drawing-room was crowded, the air heavy with the scent of wax polish and nervous anticipation. Inspector Harrow stood by the fireplace, his grey eyes scanning the assembled women. Clara, pale and anxious. Evelyn, defiant despite the accusation. Beatrice, twisting her locket with trembling fingers. Lillian, composed but watchful. And Margaret, her small frame rigid, her eyes darting to the door. Constable Reed hovered near the entrance, his notebook ready, while Tom and Elsie stood awkwardly at the back, summoned as witnesses. "Ladies," Harrow began, his voice steady, "the evidence is mounting. The arsenic vial, found with Mrs. Drake's fingerprints, suggests foul play beyond a simple theft. I need clear answers about your whereabouts the night of Mrs. Langley's attack and the days leading to the sapphire's disappearance." Evelyn's laugh was sharp, cutting through the room. "You've decided I'm a poisoner now, Inspector? Those fingerprints prove nothing. I told you, I dust the passages. Ask Elsie. She's seen me." Elsie, caught off guard, stammered, I've seen Mrs. Drake cleaning, sir, but not in the passage, not lately." Evelyn's eyes flashed. "You little liar! You're covering for someone. Tom, perhaps. He's always skulking about, near the library, the garden. Enough!" Clara interjected, her voice trembling. "Evelyn, stop accusing the staff. We're all under strain, but this isn't helping." Miss Marple, seated quietly, spoke up, her tone gentle but firm. "Inspector, might I ask if you've examined the silk scrap from Mrs. Langley's attack? Its embroidery is quite distinctive. Perhaps it matches something specific in the house." Harrow nodded, producing the scrap from an evidence bag. "We've checked. It's from a shawl, as Mrs. Henshaw said, but it's common here. Curtains, cushions, even clothing. It doesn't narrow things down." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Perhaps not yet, Inspector, but details matter. Mrs. Langley, You said you were pushed. Did you hear anything specific? A voice? A rustle of fabric?" Beatrice's hands froze on her locket, her face pale. "It was so quick, I heard a rustle, like silk, and maybe a whisper. But I couldn't make it out. I was so frightened." Lillian leaned forward, her voice smooth. "A whisper? Convenient, Beatrice. You've been nervous since the sapphire vanished. Were you really attacked, or did you stage it to divert suspicion?" Beatrice gasped, her eyes filling with tears. "How dare you? I could have been hurt, or worse. You're the one always slipping out at night, Lillian. What were you doing in the garden?" Lillian's smile tightened. "I've already told Miss Marple about my walks. I like the quiet. Unlike you, I don't need to invent drama." "Ladies!" Harrow snapped, his patience thinning. "Alibis, please. Mrs. Voss, where were you that night?" "In my room, reading," Lillian said coolly. "I heard nothing until Beatrice's scream woke me." Margaret, who had been silent, spoke up, her voice sharp. "I was asleep, as I've said. I don't creep about at night, unlike some, but I'll tell you this, Beatrice's story sounds flimsy. She's always been theatrical." Beatrice's sob broke the silence, and Clara moved to comfort her, shooting Margaret a reproachful look. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind weaving through the accusations. Each alibi was thin, each widow deflecting blame, and the staff, Tom and Elsie, seemed caught in the crossfire. She thought of the journal in her handbag, its entries hinting at debts and secrets, and the sapphire earring marked for ED. Evelyn, presumably, but why? "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tension, "have you considered the servants' passage? It's well used, yet no one admits to frequenting it. And the arsenic, its placement seems almost deliberate, as if meant to be found." Harrow's moustache twitched, a sign of irritation or respect. "We're checking the passage again, Miss Marple, but the fingerprints point to Mrs. Drake, and I can't ignore that." Evelyn stood, her face flushed. "This is a witch hunt. If you're so keen on evidence, Inspector, why not search Lillian's room again? She's too calm, too perfect. Or ask Clara about Arthur's letters. She knows more than she's saying." Clara's face crumpled, her hands twisting. "Evelyn, that's unfair. I've told Jane everything I know about the sapphire, the note." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened at the mention of the note. "The truth will break us all." She hadn't shared its contents with the others, yet Evelyn's words suggested she knew of it. "Mrs. Drake," she said softly, "how did you know about a note?" Evelyn froze, her eyes darting to Clara, then away. "I heard Clara mention it to you, that's all." Clara shook her head, bewildered. "I didn't, Evelyn. I showed it to Jane privately." The room fell silent, the widow's eyes locking on Evelyn, who stood rigid, her defiance wavering. Harrow stepped forward, his voice low. "Mrs. Drake, you'll need to explain that at the station. Constable, escort her." As Evelyn was led out, protesting, Miss Marple watched the others. Beatrice's tears had stopped, her face oddly calm. Lillian's smile was gone, her fingers tight on her brooch. Margaret stared at the floor, her lips pressed thin. Clara looked on the verge of collapse, her eyes pleading with Miss Marple. Later, in her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, her pen swift. "Evelyn knows of note. How? Fingerprints, genuine or planted. Beatrice's attack, staged or real. Lillian, hiding more than an affair. Margaret, silent but complicit." She added a line about the earring, the journal and the arsenic, sensing the threads were converging. The alibis were crumbling, but the truth was still veiled, and she knew the next confrontation might tear Ravenwood apart, or reveal its darkest secret. Chapter 11. Miss Marple's Quiet Deduction. The air in Ravenwood Hall seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, as if the house itself were tightening its grip on its secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of her guest room, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across her open notebook. Her knitting lay untouched, her mind too occupied with the threads of the mystery. The stolen raven's tear, the arsenic vial, Arthur's letters, Lillian's confession, Evelyn's fingerprints, and the cryptic note. The truth will break us all. Evelyn's removal to the police station had left the widows shaken, but Miss Marple knew the truth was still buried, waiting for her to unravel it with the patience of a knitter untangling a knot. She had spent the morning in the village, sipping tea at the local shop and listening to gossip, with her usual unobtrusive charm. The postmistress spoke of a stranger seen near Ravenwood weeks before the theft, a man in a dark coat who asked about the hall but left no name. The publican mentioned Tom's temper, sparked once when questioned about his past in London. These fragments, combined with the clues from the house, were forming a pattern, though it was not yet complete. Returning to Ravenwood, Miss Marple found Clara in the drawing-room, staring at a photograph of Arthur, her eyes red-rimmed. "Jane," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think Evelyn stole the sapphire? Or worse?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded. "Clara, my dear, people often act out of fear or desperation, not malice. Evelyn's fingerprints on the panel are troubling, but they're too convenient, don't you think? As if someone wanted her to be found out." Clara's eyes widened. "You mean someone planted the arsenic?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "In my village, I once knew a woman who hid her husband's watch to make him think he'd lost it, all to distract from her own misdeeds. Let's consider the others. Mrs. Langley, for instance. Her attack seemed genuine, but her story shifts like sand." Clara nodded slowly. "Beatrice is so nervous, always clutching that locket. And Lillian, she's too calm, too controlled. Margaret barely speaks, but I've seen her watching us, as if she knows something." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And you, Clara? You've been kind to host me, but you've not told me everything. That note in Arthur's hand. Why keep it secret from the others?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "I was afraid, Jane. Arthur wrote such strange things before he died. Letters, notes, warnings. I thought the note was a prank or a ghost from his past. I didn't want to frighten the others." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Fear makes us hide the truth, but it also reveals it. I'd like to speak to the others, one by one, if you don't mind." Over the next hour, Miss Marple met with each widow privately, her questions gentle but piercing. Beatrice, in the library, clung to her locket, admitting she'd been in the garden not just for walks but to meet Tom, who'd promised to help her sell a brooch, to pay a debt she refused to explain. "It's not the sapphire," she insisted, her voice shrill. "I'd never touch it." Lillian, in the garden, was less forthcoming, her green eyes guarded. "Yes, I loved Arthur once," she said, "but that was years ago. The sapphire meant nothing to me. If you're looking for a thief, ask Margaret. She's been sneaking into the attic thinking no one notices." Margaret, cornered in her room, was defensive, her small frame trembling. "I went to the attic to find old papers, that's all. Arthur owed my husband money, and I thought there might be proof. I didn't take the sapphire, and I didn't attack Beatrice." Miss Marple listened, her face serene, her mind weaving connections. She thought of the sapphire earring marked for ED, the journal's mention of debts and secrets, the stranger in the village, and Tom's guarded demeanour. Returning to her room, She opened her notebook, her pen swift. Beatrice, Det, meeting Tom. Lillian, deflecting to Margaret. Margaret, searching for proof, but of what? Evelyn, framed or guilty. Stranger, connected to Arthur's past. That evening, as the widows gathered for a tense dinner, Miss Marple slipped out to the garden, her flashlight probing the hedge beneath the library windows. She found another clue. A cigarette stub, its brand foreign, unlike those smoked in the village. It matched a rumour from the publican about the stranger's habits. Tucking it into her pocket, she returned to the house, where Inspector Harrow awaited, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've released Mrs. Drake for now. Insufficient evidence to hold her. But I found something else in the passage, a key, identical to the ones for the Sapphires case." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A sixth key? That changes things, Inspector. Who might have had access to make a copy?" Harrow shook his head. "Could be anyone. Servants, a visitor, even one of the widows. I'm running out of leads." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Leads are like stitches, Inspector. Sometimes you must pull one to see the whole pattern. I think we're close to seeing it." As Harrow left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her thoughts racing. The sixth key, the cigarette stub, the letters, the arsenic, all pointed to a truth hidden not just in the house, but in its past. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen ring was found in a place no one thought to look, because it was meant to be overlooked. The raven's tear, she suspected, was closer than anyone realized, and the truth it guarded would soon break free. Chapter 12. The Final Revelation. The drawing-room of Ravenwood Hall was bathed in the pale light of a late autumn morning, the fire crackling softly as the five widows gathered for what Miss Jane Marple had quietly requested be their final meeting. The air was thick with anticipation, each woman's face a mask of unease. Clara's anxious, Beatrice's tearful, Lillian's guarded, Margaret's defiant, and Evelyn's weary after her return from the police station. Inspector Harrow stood by the door, his grey eyes watchful, while Constable Reed hovered with his notebook. Miss Marple sat in an armchair, her knitting in her lap, her serene demeanour belying the storm of deductions in her mind. "Ladies," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but clear, "and Inspector, thank you for indulging me. The theft of the Raven's tear, the attack on Mrs. Langley, the arsenic, and Arthur's cryptic note have woven a tangled web, but I believe we can now unravel it." The widows shifted, their eyes flicking to one another. Harrow nodded, his moustache twitching. "Go on, Miss Marple. I'm listening." She folded her hands, her gaze steady. The Raven's tear was no ordinary jewel. Arthur's journal and letters revealed it was a symbol of control, debts, promises, and secrets tied to each of you. But its theft was not the heart of this mystery. It was a distraction, meant to hide a greater crime. Murder. A collective gasp rose. Beatrice clutched her locket. Lillian's hand froze on her brooch, and Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Clara whispered, "Murder! But who, Jane?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. Arthur Henshaw. His death, sudden and attributed to illness, was no accident. The arsenic found in the passage was a clue, but not to a future crime, to one already committed. Harrow leaned forward. "You're saying Mr. Henshaw was poisoned? There's no evidence of that." "There is, Inspector," Miss Marple said, producing the journal from her handbag. Arthur's entries mention feeling unwell, suspecting betrayal. The arsenic vial, with Evelyn's fingerprints, was placed to frame her, but its true purpose was older. I believe one of you poisoned Arthur, and the Sapphire's theft was staged to stir chaos, to keep us from looking backward. Margaret's voice was sharp. "That's absurd! Why would any of us kill Arthur? He gave us this house, a home." Miss Marple's gaze turned to Lillian. "Mrs. Voss, you admitted to an affair with Arthur years ago. His letter spoke of a delicate matter you needed funds for. Was it a child, perhaps? One you lost or gave up? Did Arthur's refusal to help later drive you to resentment?" Lillian's face paled, but she shook her head. "No, I loved him, but I never harmed him. The funds were for my husband's debts, not a child." Miss Marple nodded, then turned to Beatrice. "Mrs. Langley, your nerves and secret meetings with Tom suggest a debt you couldn't pay. Arthur's letter to BL mentioned a shared loss. Was it guilt over his death that made you stage the attack, to divert suspicion?" Beatrice sobbed, her locket falling open to reveal a tiny photograph of a young man. "It wasn't guilt. I took the sapphire, yes, to sell it. I needed money to help my nephew, but I didn't kill Arthur." The room stilled, Harrow's eyes widening. "You admit to the theft, Mrs. Langley?" Miss Marple raised a hand. "She does, but she's not the murderer. The sapphire was found this morning, hidden in Beatrice's room, behind her wardrobe. I checked before we gathered, but the true killer is someone else." Her gaze settled on Margaret Thorne, whose small frame seemed to shrink further. "Mrs. Thorne, Arthur's journal mentioned a legal debt your husband owed. One Arthur promised to settle, but he didn't, did he? Instead, he used it to keep you here, under his thumb. The sixth key, the one Inspector Harrow found, was yours, wasn't it? You copied it to access the sapphire, but not to steal it, to plant it later, after poisoning Arthur." Margaret's eyes blazed. "You've no proof. I'm no killer." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "The cigarette stub I found in the garden, a foreign brand, matches those your husband smoked, mentioned in village gossip. You kept some, didn't you, as a memento? You dropped one while watching from the garden, planning your moves. The note in Arthur's hand, 'The truth will break us all,' was a forgery, written by you to sow fear, using his old letters as a guide. And the arsenic? You hid it, but Evelyn's cleaning gave you a chance to frame her." Clara gasped, her hand to her mouth. "Margaret, is this true?" Margaret stood, her face contorted. "He ruined us. Arthur promised to clear my husband's name, but he lied, kept us in debt, controlled us. I couldn't bear it. I slipped arsenic into his tea just enough, over months. When he died, I thought it was over. But the sapphire, it was his power over us. I took it, hid it, to break his hold." Harrow stepped forward, his voice grim. "Mrs. Thorne, you're under arrest for the murder of Arthur Henshaw." As Constable Reed led Margaret away, her defiance crumbling into sobs, the widows sat in stunned silence. Beatrice clutched her locket. Lillian stared out the window, and Evelyn's shoulders sagged. Clara reached for Miss Marple's hand, her voice choked. "Jane, how did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People are like patterns, Clara. They repeat themselves. Greed, fear, love." Margaret's silence was her loudest confession. "In my village I once saw a woman hide her guilt in plain sight, just as Margaret did." As the widows dispersed, their secrets laid bare, Miss Marple packed her valise, her work done. The Raven's Tear was returned to its case, its curse broken, but Ravenwood Hall would never be the same. She boarded the train back to St. Mary Mead, her knitting in her lap, her mind already turning to the quiet rhythms of home, where secrets waited in every corner, ready for her gentle unraveling.